There is a moment just before everything breaks, when the world goes quiet. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest. It is a silence that feels wrong, the kind that makes animals stop eating and children stop playing, and old men look at the horizon with eyes that already know what is coming, even if they cannot name it yet. It is the silence that settles over a place that is about to disappear forever. This is a story about that silence, and about the people who lived inside it. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. What happened on this stretch of coast, this narrow, green, almost forgotten corridor of land between the Atlantic and the jungle, it did not happen because of evil. It did not happen because one side was monstrous and the other was pure. It happened because human beings are complicated, because fear is stronger than reason, because the distance between compassion and cruelty is much, much smaller than we like to believe. This is not a story about villains. It is a story about what happens when ordinary people are placed inside extraordinary pressures, and it is a story that, once you truly understand it, you will not be able to forget. The coast of what we now call Brazil stretches for over 8,000 kilometers. In the 16th century, it was one of the most densely populated regions of the New World, not with Europeans, but with indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. Dozens of tribes, hundreds of villages, millions of lives unfolding in patterns so old, so deeply rooted in the rhythm of the tides and the seasons, that they seemed almost eternal. They were not eternal, but for a very long time, they believed they might be. And in 1558, on a stretch of coast in what is now the state of Rio de Janeiro, or perhaps a little further north, the records are imprecise, as records of indigenous peoples often are, one of those tribes began to disappear, not slowly, not gradually, not in the way that civilizations sometimes fade, losing meaning and purpose over generations, until one day someone realizes the language is dead and the songs are forgotten. No, this tribe disappeared quickly, violently, completely. What remains of them now is almost nothing. A few words in Portuguese documents written by men who saw them only as obstacles or resources, a handful of ceramic fragments found by archaeologists decades later, and the silence, that same terrible silence that has settled over the place where they once lived. This is their story, as much of it as we can still piece together, as much of it as the silence will allow. Let me take you back, not to the moment of destruction. We will get there, I promise, and when we do, it will not be easy to listen. But first, we need to understand what was there before, what was being destroyed, because a tragedy without context is just noise, and these people deserve more than noise. The village sat where the land curved gently toward the sea, in a place where the forest thinned just enough to let the light through, but not so much that the shade disappeared entirely. The canopy above was thick and layered, a ceiling of green so dense that on rainy days, the water would collect on the leaves and drip down in a rhythm that sounded almost like music, irregular, unpredictable, but with a pattern underneath if you listened long enough. The river that fed the village was not wide. A man could cross it at the shallow points by wading up to his chest, but it was constant. It never dried up, not even in the driest months, and this made the village possible. This made everything possible. There were perhaps 300 people living there, maybe a few more, maybe fewer. The number shifted with the seasons, with births and deaths, and the occasional visit from families in neighboring villages. 300 is a reasonable estimate, enough to be a community, small enough that everyone knew everyone else, small enough that a single tragedy could be felt by every soul in the place. The houses were built close together, not in a rigid line, but in a loose arrangement that followed the natural contour of the land. Each house was constructed from a wooden frame, sturdy poles driven into the earth and bent at the top to form a gentle arch, and then covered with layers of palm leaves, woven and layered so carefully that even heavy rain could not penetrate them. Inside, the air was always cool, even when the sun outside was fierce. The smell of wood and damp earth and smoke from the cooking fires mixed together into something that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, but simply familiar, the smell of home. The people who lived here, and I want to be careful with how I describe them, because too often indigenous peoples are described in ways that reduce them to symbols or archetypes, were not a single uniform thing. They were individuals. They had personalities, preferences, fears, hopes, disagreements. Some of them were brave. Some of them were afraid of almost everything. Some of them laughed easily. Some carried grief quietly, the way people do when they have lost something and decided not to speak about it. But they shared certain things, certain ways of understanding the world that bound them together, that gave their lives a shape and a meaning that went beyond mere survival. They understood the forest, not in the abstract way that a scientist might understand an ecosystem, cataloging species and mapping relationships. They understood it the way you understand a language you have spoken since birth, intuitively, completely, without having to think about it. They knew which plants could heal and which could kill. They knew where the animals gathered and why. They knew the signs that rain was coming, or that a storm was building far out at sea, or that the river would flood in 3 days. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in the mouths and the hands of the people, passed from one generation to the next through stories and practice, and it was as real and as vital as anything written in any book. They fished. They farmed small plots of manioc and other crops in clearings near the river. They traded with neighboring villages, not for profit but for relationship. The act of trading was as much about maintaining connection as it was about acquiring goods. A man might travel for 2 days to bring a basket of dried fish to a village he had not visited in a year, and the fish was almost beside the point. What mattered was the conversation, the news, the simple act of sitting with another person and sharing a meal and knowing that you were not alone in the world. They had a spiritual life that was rich and complex and deeply woven into every part of their daily existence. The forest was not simply a place where they lived. It was alive in ways that European minds of that era, and if we are honest, our own minds, struggle to fully grasp. The trees, the rivers, the animals, the wind, these were not objects to be used. They were presences. They had agency. They could be communicated with, respected, offended, appeased. The shamans, the men and women who served as intermediaries between the visible world and the invisible one, were among the most important people in the village. Not because they held power in the political sense, but because they held knowledge. They knew how to listen to the world in ways that others could not. This is the place we are talking about. This is what was there. A community, a web of relationships between people and the land, between the living and the dead, between the seen and the unseen. It was not paradise. It was not some idealized version of nature that exists only in the imaginations of people who have never had to actually survive in a forest. It was hard. It was often uncomfortable. People got sick. Children sometimes died. The work of survival was constant and demanding. But it was a life, a real, full, meaningful life, and it had been sustained for generations, longer than anyone could remember, longer than any story could reach back to in this one small stretch of green coastline. And now it was ending. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, I want you to pause here for just a moment. What I am about to tell you, the next part of this story, is the part that changes everything. It is the part where the silence we talked about at the beginning starts to make sense. So before we cross that line, if this story is affecting you, if you want to hear how it unfolds, make sure you subscribe, because this is the kind of story that, once you start it, you need to finish. The Portuguese had been arriving on the coast of Brazil for decades before 1558. The first ones came in 1500. Cabral and his fleet, blown off course on the way to India, stumbling onto a land so vast and so green that it must have seemed almost impossible. But stumbling onto something and understanding it are two very different things. And for the first 50 years or so, the Portuguese relationship with Brazil was more extractive than colonizing. They came for the pau-brasil, the Brazil wood tree, whose red dye was enormously valuable in European textile markets. They set up trading posts along the coast. They learned, sometimes through violence and sometimes through negotiation, to work with the indigenous peoples who controlled access to the forests where the trees grew. The relationship was not always peaceful. It was not always fair, but in those early decades there was a kind of pragmatic coexistence. The Portuguese needed the indigenous peoples. They needed their knowledge of the land, their labor, their cooperation, and so, in many places, a rough equilibrium developed, uneasy, exploitative certainly on the Portuguese side, but not yet genocidal. That began to change in the 1530s and 1540s as Portugal shifted from treating Brazil as a source of raw materials to treating it as a colony, a place to be settled, governed, and controlled. The crown sent governors, missionaries arrived, and with them came a set of assumptions about the indigenous peoples that would prove catastrophic. The missionaries, primarily Jesuits, who arrived in Brazil in 1549, saw the indigenous peoples not as partners or even as enemies, but as souls to be saved. This sounds, on the surface, like it might be a form of compassion, and in many cases the individual missionaries were genuinely moved by compassion. They learned indigenous languages. They lived among the people. Some of them developed deep and genuine affection for the communities they worked with. But the act of saving someone's soul, as the missionaries understood it, required changing everything about how that person lived. Their spiritual beliefs, which were woven into every part of their daily existence, had to be replaced with Christianity. Their social structures had to be reorganized to conform to European models. Their relationship with the land, with the forest, with the invisible world, all of this had to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. The missionaries did not see this as destruction. They saw it as salvation. And this distinction, this gap between how an act appears to the person performing it and how it appears to the person on the receiving end, is one of the most important things to understand about what happened in 1558. Because the people who destroyed this tribe did not for the most part see themselves as destroyers. Some of them saw themselves as saviors. Some saw themselves as administrators, doing what was necessary for the orderly functioning of the colony. Some saw themselves as soldiers, carrying out orders. And some, a smaller number but not zero, knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway, because the rewards were worth more to them than the lives they were ending. Human beings are very good at telling themselves stories about why what they are doing is just justified. This is not unique to the 16th century. It is not unique to the Portuguese. It is one of the oldest and most persistent features of human psychology. The capacity to cause tremendous harm while genuinely believing, or at least sincerely claiming to believe, that the harm is necessary, even righteous. This is the mindset that arrived on the coast near this village in the months before 1558. And it arrived not as an abstract concept, but as a physical force, as men with weapons, as policies decided in distant capitals, as a logic of conquest that had already consumed dozens of other communities along the coast and was now turning its attention southward. There was a man in the village, let us call him by a name that feels true to the language of his people, though the records do not preserve his actual name. Let us call him Arate. It is not his name, but it is a name that could have been his, in a language that is now spoken by no one. Arate was not young. He was perhaps 45 or 50, an age that, in a society where life expectancy was not long and where the body was subjected to constant physical demands, made him one of the older members of the community. His hair had begun to grey at the temples. His hands were thick and calloused from years of work, fishing, building, clearing land. His face was weathered in the way that faces become when they have spent decades under open sky, creased and lined, but not unpleasant. He had the kind of face that suggested he had seen a great deal and had decided long ago not to be surprised by any of it. He was not a shaman. He did not hold any formal position of authority, but he was respected, the way certain people in small communities are respected without anyone having to articulate why. It was something about the way he listened. When someone came to him with a problem, a dispute with a neighbor, a worry about the harvest, a grief that had no words, Arate would sit with them for a long time, saying very little, and when he did speak, what he said was usually not advice, but rather a reframing, a way of looking at the situation that the other person had not considered. He had a gift for this, and in a community where decisions were made collectively, where consensus mattered more than authority, this kind of gift was enormously valuable. Arate had lost a wife years before. She had died during a fever that swept through the village when their youngest child was still an infant. He had raised the child alone, a boy, now perhaps 12 or 13, who had inherited his father's quiet, observant nature. The two of them lived together in a house near the edge of the village, close to the river, and their life was simple and unhurried and, by the standards of that world, comfortable. In the months before the destruction, Arate began to notice things, small things, things that individually meant nothing, but that, taken together, formed a pattern that disturbed him in ways he could not quite explain. A group of hunters from a village to the north had passed through, moving quickly, carrying nothing but weapons. They had not stopped to trade or to share a meal, which was unusual. When Arate asked one of them where they were going, the man had looked at him with an expression that Arate could not read, something between pity and fear. He said nothing and moved on. A few weeks later, a trader arrived from the coast, a mestizo, a man of mixed Portuguese and indigenous descent, who had been making the rounds of the villages for years, bringing European goods in exchange for food and labor. This time he brought nothing. He sat for a long time in the shade of one of the houses, drinking water and saying very little. And when Arate asked him what was wrong, the trader shook his head slowly. "There are soldiers," he said, "to the north. They are moving south." Arate asked what the soldiers wanted. The trader looked at him for a long time before answering. "Everything," he said, and then he left and did not come back. These moments stayed with Arate. They lodged in his mind like splinters, small, painful, impossible to ignore once you became aware of them. He did not share his worry with many people, partly because he did not want to cause unnecessary fear, partly because he was not sure yet that his worry was justified, and partly because he had spent his entire life in a place where the threats were known. The river in flood, the animals in the forest, the sickness that came with the rains, and this new threat, this unnamed thing moving toward them from the north, did not fit any pattern he recognized. He began to pay closer attention to the world around him, not just the physical world, the river, the forest, the sky, but the social world, the conversations between people, the small shifts in mood and behavior that indicate, if you are watching closely enough, that something is changing. And he noticed that others had noticed too. The shamans in particular seemed restless. One of them, an older woman named something like Irasima, though again we are guessing at the name, had been performing rituals more frequently than usual. Long rituals conducted at night that kept the village awake with their drums and chanting. When Arate asked her what she was doing, she told him she was listening. Listening to what? He asked. She looked at him with eyes that held something he had rarely seen in her. Not fear exactly, but a kind of heaviness, a weight. "To the silence," she said. "It is getting louder." Now I want to pause here for a moment, not to break the story, but to reflect on something that I think is important for us. Listening to this today, centuries later, we have a tendency to look back at moments like this, moments when a community is on the edge of destruction and does not fully understand what is coming, and to feel a kind of frustrated sympathy. We want to shake them. We want to say, "Don't you see? Can't you feel it? Why don't you But this impulse, however natural, misunderstands what it actually feels like to live inside a moment like this. Arate and the people around him were not stupid. They were not passive. They were paying attention. They were reading the signs, but the signs were ambiguous. The threat was abstract, and the human mind, even a mind as perceptive as Arate's, has a powerful tendency to resist conclusions that are too frightening to accept. This is not weakness, it is survival. In most cases, the catastrophe does not come. The soldiers move on. The threat passes. The world continues. And so the mind, faced with ambiguous evidence, defaults to hope. Not because hope is logical, but because despair is unbearable. Arate was not in denial. He was simply not yet ready to believe that the world he had always known was about to end. And who among us truly would be? The Portuguese military presence along the coast of Brazil in the 1550s was not large by European standards. There were perhaps a few thousand soldiers in the entire colony, a tiny force, spread thin across an enormous territory. But they did not need to be large. The weapons they carried, firearms, steel swords, horses, gave them an overwhelming advantage over indigenous peoples who fought with bows and clubs and spears. And the diseases they carried, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, gave them an even more devastating advantage, one that required no weapons at all. The indigenous peoples of Brazil had no natural immunity to these European diseases. They had never been exposed to them before, and when the diseases arrived, sometimes ahead of the soldiers, carried by traders or missionaries or simply by the wind, they spread with horrifying speed. A village of 300 people could be reduced to 30 in a matter of weeks. Entire families would die within days of each other. The survivors, weakened and traumatized, were in no condition to resist the soldiers who arrived in the aftermath. This pattern repeated itself along the coast dozens of times in the 16th century. It was not always planned, it was not always deliberate, but it was consistent, and by the 1550s it had become, in some regions, something close to a strategy, not an official policy of the Portuguese crown perhaps, but an understood reality among the men on the ground. Weaken the population with disease, wait for the survivors to collapse, move in. The soldiers who were moving south along the coast in the months before 1558 were part of a larger campaign to consolidate Portuguese control over the region. Their commander, we do not know his name with certainty, and I will not invent one, was a man who had served in the colony for several years. He was not, by the standards of his time, a particularly cruel man. He drank too much, probably. He was ambitious, certainly. He wanted land and influence, and the kind of permanent settlement that would secure his position in the colony for the rest of his life. But he was not a monster, and this is important to understand because it is too easy, too comfortable, to reduce the people who caused this destruction to monsters. If they were monsters, then we can distance ourselves from them. We can say, that is not who we are, that is not what we would do, but the truth is more uncomfortable than that. The commander was a product of his time and his culture and his circumstances. He had been raised in a world where indigenous peoples were not fully human, where the Catholic Church had debated, seriously and at length, whether they possessed souls at all. He had been told by his superiors and by the missionaries and by the general consensus of colonial society that the indigenous peoples were obstacles to progress, threats to order, and potential laborers to be exploited. He had internalized these beliefs so completely that they were not beliefs at all in his mind. They were simply the way things were, and so when he looked at a village of 300 people living in the forest, he did not see a community. He saw land, he saw labor, he saw a problem to be solved. This does not excuse what he did. Nothing excuses it. But understanding why he did it, understanding the machinery of thought and belief and social pressure that made it possible, is the only way to prevent it from happening again. And it has happened again, many times, in many places, under many different flags. The first sign that the soldiers were close came not from a scout or a messenger, but from the animals. Arate noticed it on a morning in what we might call late spring. Though the seasons in that part of Brazil are not as distinct as they are in temperate climates, the rains and the dry periods create their own rhythm, and Arate knew this rhythm as well as he knew his own heartbeat. He was sitting outside his house mending a fishing net when he realized that the birds had gone quiet, not all of them, but enough. The constant chorus of calls and warnings and territorial songs that filled the canopy every morning, the sound that was so ever-present that it was almost invisible, like the sound of your own breathing, had thinned noticeably, as if something had frightened them, something large and unfamiliar moving through the forest to the north. Arate set down his net and listened. For a long time he sat perfectly still, his hands in his lap, his eyes closed, letting the forest speak to him in the way it had been speaking to him his entire life. And what he heard, beneath the reduced birdsong, beneath the constant murmur of the river, beneath the wind in the leaves, was a sound that did not belong, a rhythmic thudding, not the footsteps of animals, something else, something mechanical, something human, but not human in the way he understood. He opened his eyes. The light was soft and golden, filtering through the canopy in the way it always did at this hour. Nothing looked different, nothing looked wrong, and yet everything felt wrong. The air itself seemed to carry a weight that had not been there the day before. He stood up and walked to the edge of the village, where the trees began to thin. in, and the land sloped gently toward the river. From there, he could see the opposite bank, a wall of green, undifferentiated and impenetrable. And for a long time he saw nothing, no movement, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, but the birds remained quiet, and the feeling in his chest, that splinter of unease that had been growing for weeks, became, in that moment, something sharper, something that felt for the first time like certainty. He turned back toward the village and walked slowly, deliberately, toward the house of the shaman Irasima. Irasima was already awake, though it was early. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground outside her house, her eyes open but unfocused, as if she were looking at something that was not quite in the visible world. When Arate approached, she did not startle or acknowledge him immediately. She simply continued to look at whatever it was she was looking at, and after a long moment she said, without turning her head, "You heard it too." It was not a question. Arate sat down beside her, not too close, but close enough to talk without raising his voice, and for a while they said nothing at all. This was one of the things Arate valued most about Irasima. She did not feel the need to fill silence with words. She understood that silence in the right hands could say more than any sentence. Finally, Arate spoke. "The birds," he said. "Something is in the forest." Irasima nodded slowly. "Not something," she said. "Someone. Many someones." "How many?" She was quiet for a long time, then, "Enough." Arate looked at her. Her face in the soft morning light was calm. Not the calm of ignorance or denial, but the calm of someone who has already accepted something terrible and has moved through the initial shock into a quieter, colder place. It frightened him, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Because Irasima was not a woman who frightened easily, and if she had already reached this place of cold acceptance, then what she knew must be worse than anything he had imagined. "What do we do?" he asked. She turned to him then, and her eyes, dark, deep, holding something that looked almost like sorrow, met his. "We do what we have always done," she said. "We live, we take care of each other, we face what comes." "And what comes?" She did not answer, but the way she looked at him, with a gentleness that was almost painful, told him everything her words did not. "If you are feeling the weight of this story right now, if it is settling into you the way I think it is, I want you to know that what I am about to describe is not easy, but it is important. Stories like this one are important precisely because they are difficult. They remind us that the world we live in was built, in part, on the suffering of people whose names we never learned, and the least we can do, the very least, is listen. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Not because I am asking you to do me a favor, but because staying with this story, hearing it through to the end, is an act of respect for the people who lived it. And there will be more stories like this one. Stories that matter. Stories that deserve to be told. The days that followed were strange. On the surface, life in the village continued as it always had. People fished, people cooked, children played near the river, chasing each other through the shallows with shrieks of laughter that echoed off the water. The rhythm of daily existence, the rituals of work and rest and eating and sleeping, did not change. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. A tension had entered the air, like the pressure that builds before a storm, and everyone felt it, even if no one spoke of it directly. People moved a little more quietly. Conversations, when they happened, were a little shorter, and in the evenings, when the village gathered around the fires to eat and talk, there was a new quality to the silences between words, a listening quality, as if everyone were waiting for something to be said that no one was willing to say first. Arate watched all of this with the careful attention he brought to everything. He watched the way people looked at each other, the small exchanges of glances that carried more meaning than entire conversations. He watched the way the mothers held their children a little tighter, instinctively, without seeming to realize they were doing it. He watched the way the young men, the hunters, the strongest and most physically capable members of the community, began to gather at the edges of the village in small groups, talking in low voices, their faces set in expressions that were equal parts determination and fear. He knew what they were thinking. He had been young once. He remembered the feeling, that particular combination of anger and helplessness that arises when you sense that something is threatening the people you love and you are not sure how to stop it. The young men wanted to fight. They wanted to do something, anything, that would make them feel less powerless. And Arate understood this impulse completely, even as he recognized, with the clarity that only age can provide, that it was likely to make things worse. Because the soldiers, if they came, and Arate was now almost certain they would come, would not be fought on equal terms. The young men of the village had bows and clubs and courage. The soldiers had guns, steel, horses, and behind them the full weight of an empire that had already conquered dozens of villages along this coast, and that showed no sign of stopping. This was the calculation that kept Arate awake at night, lying on his mat in the darkness, listening to the river and the insects and the breathing of his son beside him. Not whether to resist or surrender. Those words implied a choice, and Arate was beginning to understand that there might not be a choice at all, but how to face what was coming in a way that preserved, if nothing else, the dignity of his people. How to meet the end, or if it was an end, without losing the essential thing that made them who they were. He did not know the answer. He turned the question over and over in his mind. mind, like a stone in his hand, feeling its weight and its edges, and he could not find an answer that did not taste of ash. There was a young woman in the village, let us call her Tupa, who was perhaps 19 or 20 years old, and who experienced the coming catastrophe in a way that was very different from Arate's. Where he was quiet and contemplative, she was fierce, not aggressive. She was not the kind of person who picked fights or raised her voice unnecessarily, but there was a fire in her that burned steadily, constantly, like a flame that refused to go out no matter how hard the wind blew. Tupa had grown up without a father. He had died when she was very young, killed, she was told, in a conflict with a neighboring village over fishing rights. She had been raised by her mother and her grandmother, two women who were, in their own different ways, extraordinary. Her mother was practical and strong, the kind of person who could find food in a forest that seemed barren to everyone else, who could mend a roof in the middle of a rainstorm without complaint. Her grandmother was the storyteller, the keeper of the oral histories that bound the village to its past. She could sit for hours, her voice rising and falling in the rhythms of a language that had no writing, and the children would listen as if under a spell, and when she finished, they would sit in silence for a long time afterward, feeling the weight of what they had heard. Tupa had inherited something from both of them, her mother's practicality and her grandmother's fierce attachment to meaning. She was not content simply to survive. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know why things were the way they were, and what they meant, and how they connected to each other. This made her in some ways unusual among the young people of the village. Not an outcast exactly, but someone who stood slightly apart, who asked questions that others did not think to ask. When the tension began to build in the village, Tupa felt it as a physical sensation, a tightening in her chest, a restlessness in her body that would not let her sit still for long. She moved through the village like a current of water, always in motion, always watching, always trying to understand what was happening and why. She went to Arate, not because she knew him well, they were not close in the way that family or close friends are close, but because she had noticed the way he watched the world, and she instinctively recognized in him a fellow observer, someone who was paying attention. She found him sitting by the river in the late afternoon, when the light was turning gold and the water was moving slowly and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. He was not doing anything, just sitting, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes on the water, his face holding that expression she had come to recognize. Not peace exactly, but a kind of stillness that suggested he was thinking very deeply about something. She sat down beside him at a respectful distance and said nothing for a long time. The river moved, the light shifted, a bird called somewhere in the canopy above them. Finally, Tupa spoke. "What is coming?" she asked, not with fear in her voice, but with something that sounded more like anger, a demand for truth. Arate looked at her. He studied her face for a long time, the directness of her gaze, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself as if bracing against something, and he made a decision, not to spare her, not to soften what he said. She was young, but she was not a child, and she deserved the truth. "I do not know exactly," he said, "but I know it is bad. I know that the people to the north, the ones with the long guns and the metal swords, I know they are coming this way, and I know that when they arrive, they will not come to trade." Tupa absorbed this. Her face did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, a flicker of something that might have been fear, quickly suppressed, replaced by a harder expression. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Arate shook his head slowly. "I do not know," he said. And for the first time, Tupa heard something in his voice that she had not expected. Not defeat exactly, something more subtle than that. A weariness. The weariness of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is beginning to realize that the weight is too heavy to put down. They sat together in silence after that, watching the river, and neither of them spoke again until the light faded and the stars began to appear. "I want to stop here for a moment and think about something with you. We are very good as a species at telling ourselves that the bad things that happened in the past could not happen to us, that we are different now, that we have learned, that the mistakes of the 16th century, the conquests, the massacres, the systematic destruction of entire ways of life belong to a world we have left behind. But have we? Think about it honestly. Think about the places in the world today where communities are being displaced, where indigenous peoples are still losing their lands, their languages, their cultures, not to Spanish or Portuguese armies, but to corporations, to governments, to the slow and grinding machinery of economic development that treats entire ecosystems and the people who depend on them as inconveniences to be removed. The weapons have changed. The uniforms have changed. The justifications have changed. We no longer say we are saving souls, but we say we are creating jobs or building infrastructure or ensuring national security. But the fundamental dynamic, the powerful deciding that the less powerful do not matter, that their homes and their histories and their ways of being in the world are less important than what the powerful want, that dynamic has not changed at all. Arate could not have known this. He could not have imagined that 5 centuries after his village was destroyed, the same pattern would be repeating itself in other forests, on other continents, with different faces, but the same logic. But if he could have known, if somehow, across all those centuries, centuries, he could have seen what we see. I wonder what he would have thought. I wonder if he would have been surprised, or if he would have simply nodded the way he nodded at so many things and said nothing. The soldiers arrived on a morning when the mist was still hanging low over the river. There was no warning, no advance party, no messenger sent ahead to announce their presence. They simply appeared, at first as shadows in the mist, indistinct and almost ghostly, and then as the mist began to burn off in the rising sun, as figures, men, perhaps 40 of them, maybe more, some on foot, some on horses. The horses were the most frightening thing for many of the villagers, because horses were rare on this stretch of coast, and most of the people had never seen one up close. The animals were large and loud, and moved with a confidence that seemed almost aggressive, their hooves striking the ground with a sound that carried through the forest like a drum. The soldiers were armed with firearms, crude by later standards, but devastatingly effective against people who had never seen or heard one fired. Long matchlock muskets, heavy and slow to reload, but capable of sending a ball of lead through a human body with a force that was almost incomprehensible to someone who had never experienced it. They also carried swords, steel blades that gleamed in the morning light and that could cut through wood and bone with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. They did not fire immediately. They did not need to. The mere sight of them, the horses, the guns, the steel, the sheer alien presence of men who looked and moved and spoke in ways that were utterly unlike anything the villagers had ever encountered, was enough to produce a paralysis that went far beyond fear. It was a kind of cognitive shock, a rupture in the fabric of the known world. Everything that these people had understood about reality, about what was possible, about what the world looked like, about the relationship between human beings and the land they lived on, all of it was suddenly violently wrong. Arate saw them from the edge of the village. He had been up since before dawn, unable to sleep, and he had been sitting outside his house in the grey pre-light, listening to the forest, when the sound of hooves reached him. He stood up slowly, his body tense, his heart beating with a speed and force that he could feel in his throat. And then he saw them, emerging from the tree line, and something inside him, something that had been bracing itself for weeks, went very quiet, very still. This is the moment that the story has been building towards since the beginning, the moment when the silence we talked about at the very start, that wrong silence, that heavy silence, finally makes sense. This is the moment when everything begins to end. The commander, the man whose name we do not know, the man who was neither a monster nor a saint, but simply a product of his time and his ambitions, rode at the front of the group on a bay horse that was sweating lightly in the humid air. He was not a large man, medium height, medium build, with a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, but simply unremarkable, the kind of face you would not remember seeing in a crowd. He wore the worn leather and faded cloth of a colonial soldier, practical and utilitarian, and at his side hung a sword that had seen better days, nicked and dulled from use, but still deadly. He surveyed the village from the back of his horse with an expression that was difficult to read, not triumphant, not angry, something more neutral than either of those things, calculating, the expression of a man who is looking at a problem and thinking about how to solve it efficiently. Behind him, his soldiers spread out in a loose formation, their muskets held casually but readied. Some of them were nervous. This was not for all of them a routine operation, and the faces of the villagers watching them from the edges of the clearing held expressions that even the most hardened soldier might find uncomfortable to look at directly. Others were bored. They had done this before or something like it, and the novelty had long since worn off. A few were drinking from flasks, fortifying themselves against the morning chill, or against something else that the alcohol could only partially address. The commander raised his hand, a simple gesture, barely perceptible, and the soldiers stopped moving. A silence fell over the clearing, not the silence of the forest, which was never truly silent, but a human silence. The silence of dozens of people holding their breath at the same time. And then the commander spoke, in Portuguese, a language that no one in the village understood. His voice was not loud. He did not shout. He simply spoke, in a measured and business-like tone, as if he were addressing a group of workers at the beginning of a shift. He explained, to no one who could understand him, that he was claiming this land in the name of the Portuguese crown, that the people living here were expected to submit to Portuguese authority, that resistance would be met with force. He paused, waited, as if expecting a response that of course could not come, because no one present spoke his language. Then he turned to one of his men, a younger soldier, perhaps a sergeant, and said something in a low voice. The sergeant nodded and rode forward toward the nearest group of villagers, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been given an unpleasant task and has decided to get it over with as quickly as possible. What happened next unfolded over the course of several days. It did not happen all at once. It happened in stages, in increments of escalation that followed a pattern so consistent, so repeated across dozens of similar encounters along the Brazilian coast that it might almost be called a procedure. First, the soldiers established control of the village. They positioned themselves at the entrances and exits, cutting off escape routes. They confiscated weapons, bows, clubs, spears, collecting them in a pile at the center of the clearing with an efficiency that suggested this too was routine. The villagers watched this happen with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to terror, and very few of them resisted. What would resistance have looked like? A man throwing himself at a soldier with a gun, a woman running into the forest with her children, knowing that the soldiers on horseback could cover the ground 3 times as fast as she could on foot. The options were so limited as to be almost non-existent. And so most of the people simply stood where they were, or sat down where they had been sitting, and watched what was happening to them with a kind of numb attention that was not quite fear and not quite acceptance, but something in between, a state of suspended animation, as if the mind had decided to postpone its full response until later, when it could process what was happening without being overwhelmed. Second, the soldiers began to separate the villagers into groups, men in one area, women and children in another. The elderly, those who could not move quickly or who were too sick to stand for long periods, were left where they were, in their houses, attended by a single soldier who watched them with the detached vigilance of a guard. This separation was not accidental. It was deliberate. It was a way of controlling the population, of preventing any organized resistance, of making each individual feel isolated and vulnerable, and it worked. Within hours of the soldiers' arrival, the social fabric of the village, the web of relationships and mutual support that had sustained the community for generations, had been torn apart. People who had lived beside each other for decades were suddenly on opposite sides of the clearing, unable to see each other, unable to communicate, unable to offer even the small comforts, a touch, a word, a shared glance that human beings rely on in moments of crisis. Arate was placed with the other men. He did not resist when the soldiers gestured to him to move. He walked calmly, deliberately to the designated area and sat down on the ground and looked at the faces of the men around him. Some he knew well, lifelong friends, hunting companions, men he had shared meals and stories with for decades. Others he knew less well, but had seen every day of his life, the way you see the trees in your own forest without really looking at them. Now he looked at them, really looked, and what he saw in their faces, the fear, the confusion, the dawning understanding of how helpless they were, was one of the hardest things he had ever seen in his life. He wanted to say something to them, something that would help, something that would make the fear a little less paralyzing, the confusion a little less disorienting. But what do you say to people in a moment like this? What words exist that can bridge the gap between the world as it was yesterday and the world as it is today? He said nothing. He simply sat with them, his presence a small and inadequate comfort, and he waited. On the other side of the clearing, Tupar was with the women and the children. She had been near the river when the soldiers arrived, washing clothes, a task she had performed hundreds of times before, a task so routine that she could do it without thinking, her hands moving through the motions automatically while her mind was elsewhere. She had heard the horses first. The sound had reached her before she saw anything, a rhythmic clopping that she did not immediately recognize, because horses were rare enough in her world that the sound was almost abstract, a noise without a clear source. By the time she looked up and saw them, the soldiers were already in the village, already spreading out, already collecting weapons. And by the time she understood what was happening, what the men with the guns and the swords actually represented, it was too late to do anything but comply. She had been directed, along with the other women, to the area on the far side of the clearing. She had walked there without protest, her body moving on autopilot while something inside her, something deeper than thought, deeper than emotion, began to shut down, the way a body shuts down when the shock is too great for the conscious mind to process. But Tupa was not the kind of person who stayed shut down for long. Within hours, something in her had begun to reassemble itself. Not hope. Hope felt too fragile, too easily broken. Something harder than hope, something closer to defiance. A refusal to accept that this was the end. A refusal to believe that the world she knew, the river, the forest, the faces of the people she loved, could simply be erased from existence. She watched the soldiers. She watched the way they moved, the way they spoke to each other, the way they handled their weapons. She watched the way they looked at the villagers, or more often the way they did not look at them at all, as if the villagers were furniture, or animals, or simply features of the landscape that happened to be inconvenient. And she began to think, not emotionally, but strategically. She began to think about what was going to happen next, and what, if anything, could be done about it. This was perhaps the most remarkable thing about Tupar. In a moment when most people were consumed by fear or paralyzed by shock, she was thinking, not about herself, or not only about herself, but about her people, about what could be saved, about what could be preserved, even if everything else was lost. She did not know yet what that might be, but she held the question inside her like a flame, and she did not let it go out. The second day was when the killing began. It did not begin with the whole village. It began with a few men, perhaps 5 or 6, who had been singled out by the soldiers and led away from the main group early in the morning before the sun had fully risen. The other men watched them go. No one spoke. The soldiers who escorted them did not explain where they were taking them or why. An hour later, the sound of gunshots echoed through the forest. 3 shots, then silence, then 2 more. The sound carried clearly in the humid air, sharp and flat and utterly alien, a sound that had no place in the acoustic landscape landscape of that forest that did not belong to any animal or any natural phenomenon. It was a sound that could only mean one thing, and everyone in the village understood what it meant, even those who had never heard a gun fired before. The women held their children tighter. Some of the children began to cry. Others went very quiet, their eyes wide and uncomprehending, sensing the fear around them without understanding its source. Among the men, the reaction was different. A few of them made sounds, low, guttural sounds of grief or rage that were almost involuntary, the sounds that the body makes when the mind cannot yet form words. Others sat in silence, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on nothing. One man, a hunter, young and strong, with a body built for physical labor, began to shake. Not visibly at first, a trembling in his hands that spread slowly up his arms and into his shoulders, a trembling that he could not control and that he tried desperately to hide, because to show fear in front of the soldiers was to invite more attention, and more attention was the last thing anyone wanted. Arate did not shake, he did not cry out. He sat very still, his hands on his knees, and he listened to the echo of the gunshots fading into the forest, and something inside him, something that had been holding itself together through sheer force of will for weeks, finally, quietly, broke. Not visibly, not dramatically. There was no moment of collapse, no outward sign that anything had changed, but inside, in the place where a man keeps his essential self, his sense of who he is and what the world means and whether any of it matters, something shifted, something fundamental and irreparable. The world he had known, the world he had understood, the world that had made sense to him for 50 years, that world was gone. And what was replacing it was something he could not yet look at directly, because to look at it directly would be to understand, with full clarity, what was about to happen to everyone he loved. He looked at the hands of the man beside him, an old friend, a man he had known since childhood, and he saw that the friend's hands were trembling too, and Arate reached over, slowly, and placed his own hand over his friend's, not to stop the trembling, that was beyond anyone's power, but simply to say, I am here, you are not alone. Whatever happens, you are not alone. It was the smallest possible gesture, and it was, in that moment, the only thing that mattered. Before we continue, and we must continue, because the story is not finished and the ending matters, I want to ask you something. Think about a moment in your own life when everything seemed stable, when the world around you felt solid and predictable and safe, and then think about how quickly that can change. How one day can be ordinary, and the next can be the day that divides your life into before and after. Most of us have experienced something like this on a smaller scale. The phone call that changes everything, the diagnosis, the loss, the moment when you realize that the ground you were standing on was not as solid as you thought. Now imagine that, but multiplied by thousands. Imagine an entire community experiencing that moment at the same time. Imagine hundreds of people all at once, losing not just their safety but their entire world, their home, their history, their sense of meaning and purpose and belonging. That is what was happening in this village, and the reason I am asking you to imagine it, to try however imperfectly to feel what those people felt, is because this is the only way to truly understand what a story like this means, not as a historical fact, not as a statistic, but as an experience. A lived, felt, breathed experience of human suffering, and if that experience moves you, if it stays with you after this video ends, then pass it on. Share this story, because the more people who understand what happened here and what continues to happen in places around the world where the powerful destroy the lives of the less powerful, the harder it becomes to look away. The killings continued over the next 2 days, not all at once, not in a single massacre that could be described as a single event, but in small groups, taken away at irregular intervals, and the shots heard from somewhere in the forest, and the silence that followed. The pattern was deliberate. The soldiers understood, whether through experience or through instinct, that the fear generated by this method was more effective than any single act of violence could be. A massacre might provoke resistance. It might galvanize the survivors into desperate action. But this slow incremental elimination, this grinding away at the population one small group at a time, produced something different. It produced a kind of helpless, paralyzed horror that made resistance almost impossible. Each time a group of men was led away, the remaining villagers were forced to confront not only the loss of those specific individuals, but the growing certainty that their own turn would come. It was in its terrible way efficient, and efficiency, the ruthless optimization of outcomes, was something the Portuguese colonial enterprise understood very well. Tupá watched all of this from the women's area. She saw the men being led away. She heard the shots. She watched the faces of the women around her, the way grief and fear moved through them like weather, visible and palpable and impossible to hide, and she continued to think, continued to look for something, anything that could be done. On the afternoon of the second day, she made a decision. It was not a decision born of hope. It was not a plan exactly, in the strategic sense. It was more like an impulse, a deep, almost instinctual conviction that she needed to do something, that passive waiting was intolerable, that if she simply sat here and watched her world end, something essential inside her would die along with everything else. She waited until the soldiers soldier guarding the women's area turned his back. A brief moment, no more than a few seconds, when his attention was elsewhere, and then she moved, not running, not dramatically, simply standing up and walking, quickly and quietly, toward the edge of the clearing, toward the trees, toward the only thing that had ever offered her refuge and safety, the forest. She made it perhaps 20 steps before a voice behind her, sharp, commanding in Portuguese, ordered her to stop. She did not stop. Another voice, closer now, the sound of boots on the ground, moving fast, and then a hand on her shoulder, gripping hard, spinning her around, a soldier's face close to hers, younger than she expected, with eyes that held something that might have been surprise or might have been anger or might have been both. He said something in Portuguese that she did not understand, and his grip on her shoulder tightened, and for a moment the two of them stood there, face to face, each looking at the other across an unbridgeable gulf of language and culture and experience. Tupa did not cry. She did not beg. She looked at the young soldier with an expression that was, by all accounts, or rather, by the account that exists, fragmentary and uncertain as it is, utterly calm. A calm that was not passivity, but something else entirely. Something that the young soldier perhaps could not quite identify, but that made him, for just a moment, uncomfortable. He led her back to the women's area. He did not speak to her again, and Tupa sat back down in the dirt and resumed watching, and resumed thinking, and the flame inside her, the refusal to accept, the insistence on meaning, burned on. There is a moment in every tragedy when the outcome becomes inevitable, when all the decisions that could have gone differently have already been made, and what remains is simply the playing out of consequences. A falling stone cannot be caught. A fire that has caught the dry wood cannot be put out by wishing. There is a point, quiet, unmarked, invisible to the people living inside it, when everything that is going to happen has already been determined. For this village, that point had come before the soldiers arrived. It had come, perhaps, when the first reports of their movement reached the coast. It had come when the colonial government decided that this stretch of land needed to be cleared. It had come when the commander was given his orders. It had come even earlier than that, when the entire machinery of colonization, the economic pressures, the religious imperatives, the political ambitions, the accumulated weight of decades of conquest had turned its attention to this particular patch of green coastline. None of the people in the village could have changed this. Not Arate, with his wisdom and his quiet strength. Not Tupa, with her fire and her refusal to surrender. Not Irasima, with her knowledge of the invisible world and her capacity to read the signs that others missed. The forces arrayed against them were too large, too powerful, too deeply embedded in the structure of the world as it existed in 1558 for any individual act of resistance to have made a difference. This is one of the hardest truths about history. Not every story has a turning point where the right choice, made at the right moment, could have changed everything. Sometimes the outcome is fixed long before anyone realizes it. Sometimes the tragedy is not the result of a single mistake or a single act of cruelty, but the inevitable consequence of a system of power and belief and economic interest that has been building for generations and that crushes everything in its path, not because it is evil, but because it is indifferent. The soldiers did not hate the people of this village. Most of them probably felt nothing at all, or at most a vague discomfort that they suppressed with alcohol or with the simple expedient of not thinking about it too hard. They were doing a job. They were following orders. They were pursuing their own interests. Land, money, a secure position in the colony, in a world that had told them explicitly and implicitly that these interests mattered more than the lives of the people they were displacing. This does not make what they did acceptable. It does not excuse it, but it does make it understandable. And understanding in the end is more useful than condemnation, because condemnation allows us to place the blame entirely on others, on the soldiers, on the commander, on the Portuguese crown. Understanding forces us to ask a harder question. What would we have done in their place, with their beliefs, their incentives, their understanding of the world? It is not a comfortable question, but it is the only question that leads somewhere useful. On the third day, the soldiers began to burn the houses. They did it methodically, starting at one end of the village and working their way through, setting fire to each structure in turn. The palm leaf roofs caught quickly. They were dry despite the humidity, having been cured in the sun over months and years of use, and the flames spread fast, consuming the careful work of generations in minutes. The wooden frames lasted longer, blackening and collapsing inward with sounds that were almost like sighs, as if the houses themselves were exhaling for the last time. The smoke rose in thick columns, visible for miles, and the smell, wood and palm, and the particular acrid scent of burning organic matter filled the air and coated everything in a thin grey haze that made the sunlight look sickly and wrong. The villagers watched this happen from where they had been confined, some in the open clearing, others now in a makeshift enclosure of roped-together branches that the soldiers had constructed to hold the prisoners more securely. The children watched with wide eyes, some of them crying, some of them silent, all of them understanding, in the way that children understand things they are not supposed to understand, that something irreversible was happening. Arate watched the fire fire consume his house, the house he had built with his own hands, the house where he had raised his son, the house that had been the center of his world for decades. And he felt something that was not grief exactly, because grief implies a loss that you did not expect. He had expected this. He had known since the morning the soldiers arrived that this was coming. But expecting something and experiencing it are not the same thing. The knowledge that the house was burning did not make the sight of it any less devastating. His son was beside him. The boy, 12 or 13 years old, with his father's quiet eyes and his mother's stubbornness, had not said a word since the soldiers arrived. He had simply stayed close to Arate, pressed against his side like a shadow, his small body taut with a fear that was too large for him to process. Now, watching the fire, the boy's hand found his father's and gripped it tightly, so tightly that it hurt, and Arate gripped back just as tightly, and neither of them looked away from the flames. What does a man think in a moment like this? What passes through the mind when you are watching the physical manifestation of your entire life being destroyed before your eyes? I think, and this is speculation, because no one can truly know what another person thinks in such a moment, I think Arate thought about his wife, the woman who had died years before in the fever that took so many. He thought about the way she had laughed, a sound he could still hear even after all these years if he closed his eyes and let the memory come. He thought about the morning he had found her body cold beside him, and the way the world had gone quiet after that, in a way that was different from the quiet of grief, but no less devastating. He thought about his son, this boy beside him, this small, warm presence that was the closest thing to a reason to keep living that he had left. And he thought, what happens to him now? What kind of world is he going to grow up in? What kind of life can there be after this? And the answer that he could not quite face directly, but that pressed against the edges of his consciousness like water against a dam, was there might not be a life, there might not be an after. If you have been listening to this story, really listening, not just hearing it in the background while you do something else, then I want you to know that what you are feeling right now is appropriate. This story is meant to be felt, not just understood intellectually, but felt in your chest, in your throat, in the place where empathy lives, that place that connects us across all the distances of time and culture and experience to other human beings. And if what you are feeling is making you want to do something, to act, to make a difference, to refuse to be part of a world that allows these things to happen, then hold on to that feeling, because it matters, not in the small immediate sense of fixing anything that happened in 1558. That is beyond anyone's power, but in the larger sense of shaping who we are and what kind of world we build from here. Subscribe if you haven't already. Not as a transaction, not because I'm offering you something in return, but because staying with stories like this one and seeking them out and letting them change the way you see the world, that is one of the most human things you can do. And right now, being human, truly, fully, painfully human, might be the most important thing any of us can do. The commander made his decision on the afternoon of the third day. He had been watching the operation with the detached efficiency of a man who is accustomed to this kind of work. He had walked through the burning village, inspecting the destruction, checking on his men, making small adjustments to the plan as the situation evolved. He had not spoken to any of the villagers, not because he could not have found a way to communicate, but because there was nothing to say. The communication had already been made, in the most eloquent language available, fire and guns and the systematic dismantling of everything they had ever known. Now he stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the ruins of the village, the smoking frames of houses, the scattered possessions, the ash settling on everything like a fine grey snow, and he made his decision. It was not, in his mind, a decision about murder. It was a decision about practicality. The villagers who remained, whilst perhaps 200 of them, men, women and children, could not be left here. They had no homes, no food stores, no means of sustaining themselves, and they could not simply be released into the forest where they might regroup and resist, or where they might join with other villages further south and create a larger problem. The options, as he saw them, were limited. Some of the villagers could be taken as laborers, the strongest men and the healthiest women, conscripted into the colonial economy to work in the fields or the mines or on the construction projects that the expanding colony required. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, standard practice along the coast. Indigenous peoples were conscripted, sometimes voluntarily, often not, and put to work in conditions that were, by any measure, brutal and dehumanizing. Many of them died within months of beginning their service, worn out by labor and disease and the simple despair of having been torn from everything they had ever known. The rest, the elderly, the sick, the very young, those who were too weak or too traumatized to be useful as laborers, were a problem that the commander solved with the same pragmatic efficiency he brought to everything else. He gave the order in the late afternoon, when the light was beginning to fade and the shadows were lengthening across the clearing. He gave it quietly to his sergeant in a few words that carried the weight of a sentence that had already been written long before this moment, and the sergeant nodded because he understood, and because he too had done this before, or something enough like it that the distinction did not matter. I'm not going to describe what happened next in graphic detail, not because I am afraid of the truth or because I want to protect you from it, but because some things do not need to be described in order to be understood. Some things are communicated more effectively by what is left unsaid, by the silence around them, by the space they occupy in the listener's imagination, by the weight of what has come before. What I will say is this: it happened quickly, quicker than you might expect. The soldiers were efficient, as soldiers tend to be when they have been given a clear objective and the authority to carry it out. And the people, the ones who were chosen, the ones who were led away from the others one final time, did not resist. Not because they lacked the will to resist, but because resistance at that point would have accomplished nothing except prolonging the suffering. Some of them walked calmly, some of them wept. Some of them carried children in their arms, holding them close, whispering words that no one else could hear, words that might have been prayers or promises or simply the names of the people they loved, spoken one last time into the air before the air itself was taken from them. Arate was among them. He had known since the second day that this was likely how it would end. The knowledge had settled into him gradually, like sediment settling to the bottom of a river, slowly, quietly, without drama. And by the time the soldiers came for him, he had already done the hardest thing a man can do in such a situation. He had accepted it, not passively, not with resignation or surrender, but with a kind of clarity that comes only when all other options have been exhausted and what remains is simply the choice of how to face the inevitable. He had spent his last hours sitting with his son, talking to him, not about the soldiers or the destruction or the fear, but about the things that mattered: the river, the forest, the way the light looked in the early morning when the mist was still on the water, the stories his mother used to tell, the names of the birds that sang at dawn. He was trying to give his son something to carry, something that could not be burned or shot or taken away by force, a memory, a way of seeing the world that was theirs, that belonged to their people, that would survive, and however faintly, however imperfectly, as long as the boy lived to remember it. When the soldiers came for him, Arate stood up slowly. He looked at his son, looked at him for a long time with an expression that held everything a father could possibly feel for a child, and then he turned and walked toward the soldiers without being told twice. He did not look back. Tupa survived. She survived because she was young and healthy and strong enough to be useful as a laborer. The soldiers selected her along with perhaps 40 or 50 others, men and women of working age, people whose bodies could still be put to productive use in the colonial economy, and they were bound together with rope and led away from the village southward along the coast toward one of the Portuguese settlements. She did not know at the time what awaited her there. She did not know that the labor she would be forced to perform would be brutal and exhausting, that the conditions would be inhuman, that many of the people around her would die within months. She did not know that she herself would survive, not because of any particular strength or luck, but because of a combination of factors that were almost random: a body that was resistant to certain diseases, a temperament that refused to give up, and a simple, stubborn refusal to die that seemed to operate independently of any conscious decision. What she knew in that moment was this: her people were gone. The village was ash. The river, the forest, the world she had been born into, all of it had been taken from her in the space of 3 days by men who did not even know her name. And she knew one other thing. She knew that she was still alive, and that being alive in the aftermath of a destruction like this was not a gift. It was a burden, a responsibility, because someone had to remember. Someone had to carry the memory of what had been here, what had existed in this place, what had been destroyed, and hold it against the silence that would otherwise swallow everything. Tupa did not know, as she walked south with the rope cutting into her wrists, that she would be the one to do this. She did not know that in the years and decades that followed, she would tell the story of her village to anyone who would listen, to other captive indigenous people, to mestizo traders, to the occasional missionary who showed enough humanity to care. She did not know that fragments of her testimony would eventually make their way into Portuguese documents, where they would be recorded in the imperfect and biased language of the colonizers, but would nonetheless preserve, like insects in amber, some small trace of the life that had existed here. She did not know any of this, but she walked and she remembered, and she did not let the flame go out. The village itself was gone within a week. The soldiers burned what could be burned. The jungle, which was always waiting at the edges of any human clearing, began to reclaim the space almost immediately. Within months, the undergrowth had covered the ashes. Within years, the outline of the houses was barely visible. Within decades, a person walking through that stretch of forest would have seen nothing to suggest that anyone had ever lived there. The river continued to flow as it always had. The birds returned to the canopy gradually as the smoke cleared and the forest began to heal. The mist settled on the water in the early mornings, just as it had for centuries before the soldiers came, and just as it would for centuries after they left. The world, in its vast and indifferent way, continued, but something was missing, something that could not be replaced or restored or compensated for: a way of life, a language, a set of relationships between people and the land, between the living and the dead, that had taken generations to build and that had been destroyed in 72 hours. This is what loss looks like on a civilizational scale, not a dramatic event, not a moment of apocalyptic apocalyptic destruction that leaves the world visibly scarred, but a quiet disappearance, a silence where there used to be sound, an absence that over time becomes so complete that most people do not even know it exists. I want to end with a reflection, not on what happened, we have covered that as thoroughly as the fragmentary historical record allows, but on what it means for us here now in a world that has moved so far from 1558 that the events of that year feel almost impossibly distant. The destruction of this tribe was not an anomaly, it was not an aberration. It was one instance, one among hundreds, perhaps thousands, of a pattern that repeated itself across the Americas, across Africa, across Asia, across every continent where European powers expanded their reach in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. The scale of the destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. Estimates suggest that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 90% in the centuries following European contact, not primarily through warfare, but through disease, displacement, forced labor, and the systematic dismantling of indigenous societies. 90%. Think about that number for a moment. Think about what it means. If your community were reduced by 90%, if 9 out of every 10 people you knew simply ceased to exist, what would be left? What could possibly survive? And yet somehow, people did survive. Indigenous peoples across the Americas survived. Not easily and not without enormous cost, but they survived. They adapted. They found ways to preserve, however imperfectly, the essential elements of their cultures and their identities. They resisted in ways both visible and invisible the forces that sought to erase them. This is one of the most remarkable stories in human history, and it is a story that most of us know almost nothing about. Not because it has not been told. It has been told by indigenous scholars and historians and artists and activists for decades, but because the structures of power that destroyed these civilizations in the first place are the same structures that determine whose stories get told and whose stories get ignored. Tupa's story, or what little we know of it, survived because she insisted on telling it, because she refused to let the silence win. And we are here, listening to it now, 5 centuries later, because someone, some chain of someones, stretching across all those years, decided that this story mattered, that these people mattered, that what happened to them deserved to be remembered. Arate's son survived too. We do not know much about what happened to him after the destruction of the village. The records, such as they are, do not follow individual indigenous people with any consistency or care. He was a child. He was taken, along with the other survivors, to one of the Portuguese settlements along the coast. What happened to him there? Whether he was baptized, given a Portuguese name, put to work, sent to a mission school, we cannot say with certainty. But there is a possibility, and this is speculation, based on patterns that historians have identified in similar cases, that he survived long enough to grow up, that he found his way eventually back to the coast near where he was born, that he lived out his life in the shadow of the forest that had once been his home, carrying inside him the memories his father had given him in those last hours, the river, the light, the names of the birds. If he did survive, if he lived to old age, as some indigenous people in similar situations did, then he would have seen over the course of his lifetime the continued expansion of Portuguese colonization along the coast. He would have seen more villages destroyed, more peoples displaced, more forests burned. He would have seen the slow, grinding transformation of the land he grew up on from a living ecosystem into a colonial economy. And he might have wondered, in the quiet moments, in the late afternoons when the light fell through the trees in the way his father had described, whether anyone would ever know what had been here, whether anyone would ever tell the story. He could not have known that the answer was yes, that centuries later, in a world his father could not have imagined, someone would piece together the fragments and tell this story. Not perfectly, not completely, but with as much truth and as much care as the silence would allow. Just there is a beach, somewhere on the coast of what is now Rio de Janeiro state, or perhaps a little further north, where the land curves gently toward the sea and the forest comes down close to the water, and on quiet mornings, when the mist is still on the surface, the place looks almost exactly as it might have looked in 1558. The river is still there, smaller perhaps than it once was, diminished by development and deforestation upstream, but still flowing, still making its way to the sea with the same patient, unhurried movement it has always had. If you were to stand on that beach, on a morning like the one I described, when the light is soft and the air is thick with moisture and the birds are singing in the canopy above, and if you were to listen, really listen, the way Arate listened, the way Irasima listened, the way the people of that village listened every morning of their lives, you might hear something, not a voice, not a message, not anything so direct or so dramatic, but a presence, a quality in the air, a sense that this place holds something, some memory, some echo, some residual trace of the lives that were lived here and the love that was felt here and the grief that was suffered here that has not entirely disappeared. Perhaps that is just the way certain places feel, places where important things happened, places where the boundary between the past and the present is thinner than it is elsewhere. Or perhaps it is something else, something that we do not have a word for in any uncanny language, a way in which the dead leave a mark on the world that persists long after the physical evidence has been erased. Arate might have had a word for it. Irakama almost certainly did. But their words are gone now, lost with the language that carried them, dissolved into the silence that has settled over this stretch of coast, like a fine mist that never quite lifts. This story does not end with hope. I will not pretend that it does, because to do so would be to dishonor the people it is about. What happened here was a tragedy, not the kind of tragedy that contains within it the seeds of redemption, but the kind that simply is. A loss, an irreversible, unrecoverable loss of something that can never be restored. But it ends with something small and fragile, and perhaps not so different from hope after all. It ends with the fact that we are here, that we know, that the story was told and heard and felt, that the silence did not win completely, that somewhere in the vast and indifferent machinery of history, a crack opened up, and through that crack, a voice came through, faint, distant, but present. Tupa's voice, Arate's memory, the names of the birds at dawn, and now yours. You heard this story, you sat with it, you let it in. And that, in a world that makes it very easy to look away from the suffering of others, that makes it very easy to tell yourself that the past is the past and there is nothing to be done, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the most important things a human being can do. Remember them, not as a statistic, not as a footnote in a history book, but as people with real lives, who loved and feared and hoped and grieved, and who deserved better than what they got. Remember them. And if this story has stayed with you, if it has changed even slightly the way you see the world, then share it. Not for my sake, for theirs, because their story deserves to be heard by as many people as possible, because every person who hears it is one more person who knows, and knowing in the end is the only weapon that truly lasts. The coast is quiet now. The mist rises in the mornings. The river moves toward the sea. But somewhere, in the space between the silence and the sound, in the place where memory lives and the dead are not entirely gone, they are still there. This narrative is based on the historical reality of Portuguese colonization of the Brazilian coast in the 16th century. The specific names and some details have been imagined, as the historical record preserves very little about the individual indigenous peoples who were destroyed during this period. The patterns of colonization, the methods used by Portuguese soldiers, the scale of indigenous population decline, and the broad historical context are drawn from established scholarship on Brazilian colonial history. The silence that this story describes, the silence of peoples whose names and stories were never recorded, is itself the most historically accurate element of all.